Well, we all knew that when this started, we would be getting to this one eventually. I never had the first-hand experience with Resident Evil when this game came out, so I never got to see how bad it actually was at the time, which is why it's interesting at the very least to retro-review games like this, just like Assassin's Creed Unity. Let's open this one up and see what we're in for. Well, right off the bat, Resi 6 is legitimately one of, if not the longest Resi game ever made, comprising not just 2, but 4 different stories for each of its pairs of protagonists. But that's going to be the tagline of Resident Evil 6. It had all of the crazy ideas put into its code when it was on the drawing board. To talk about the game in specifics, I guess we'll just have to run down the list and see what each legacy character got themselves into this time. The first one on the list is Leon and Athena. I believe this was her name at the time. Honestly, I can't really remember half of the characters that were in this game, so I'm just gonna believe what I'm going to believe. They start off their story working for the president directly in the middle of another classic zombie outbreak, all set up to topple the order of the country. Leon's role as personal bodyguard didn't last too long, since the president, rather than using his insane resources as country leader, decided to go down to a local highfalutin college to look for his daughter personally. Did all of the other Secret Service agents, all the army people, and all of the Coast Guard just die simultaneously? Why is he doing this literally himself? This being a Resi game and she not being the protagonist, this obviously didn't go well, with the daughter killed by zombies and both of them falling to the reanimating disease, and for whatever reason, Leon was almost killed by the president zombie in spite of it being 15 times less effective than the original zombie. Probably to have this game appeal to a wider audience, that classic failure of late-stage franchising, Capcom decided to lobotomize its legacy characters, which ended up with the decision to have Leon not understand how to deal with a singular zombie while armed with his pistol. It was one of the more moronic moments of the day for Capcom, and we've only just gotten started. Once Leon and Athena escape to general safety, we get to the second carrot on a stick that Leon's campaign has, Athena's bullshit. Ubisoft may be the Hollywood copy-paster of the industry, but Capcom does a good job of reinterpreting those classic stereotypical plots. Athena was on the Secret Service, or some other security position in the government, who was chasing down a lead and information while helping Leon find the president's daughter. The problem for Leon is that Athena is expecting him to help her in her endeavors, but she also won't tell Leon what she's actually trying to do, and quite literally just leading him on for almost half of his campaign, until several fraughts with death later, he finally grows enough of a backbone to draw a line and tells her to give him her story or he's walking out. It turns out that before the events of the game, she and her sister were kidnapped by the Secretary of Homeland Security. I've totally forgot his name, so we're just going to call him Sergeant. Sergeant ended that situation by taking the sister away as a test subject that was reactivated to fight Leon, and the pair discovered the lab of the C virus, an improved offshoot of the black market T virus experiments. In order to try and secure the fate of the sister, Athena offered her security job services to Sergeant in exchange for her safety. After the sister was killed by the pit of despair, Athena makes a vow of revenge against Sergeant to avenge her zombie sister. So yeah, Athena is making all of the calls and Leon is helping her because he has nothing better to do with his day. Well, to be fair, Sergeant is trying to use his connections to spark a new umbrella company with him at the head, but for the most part, the new company is basically 2 people throwing the C virus at anyone who looks at them funny. Then, obviously, it ends up on themselves because even though Umbrella died years ago, this shit is still happening with zero precautions or safety anything. The other issue is that the C virus is way more metal than the T virus or the Veronica virus, since you have to fight Sergeant's mutations around 5 times in ridiculously high-octane moments. I would think that by just seeing these little snippets that Resident Evil 6 could out-action movie any actual action movie with how many explosions, impossible acrobatics, stunts, and monsters that they just put on screen constantly. But the problem with Resi 6 is that the entire game is this. It's a really bizarre experience because once you start with your first hour of this game, depending if you could make it that far, you would start thinking that the game would take breaks between the action, but it doesn't. The game is just straight crazy for the entire runtime, which would honestly be pretty freaking awesome if the gameplay worked. But just like Call of Duty Ghosts, the game is actively murdering you if you don't follow the script word for word that it's written out. It's a crazy, edge-of-seat spectacle showcase of a video game, but the game is so restrictive of your actual gameplay that it's just not fun at all. One of the most frequent tricks that Resi 6 likes to pull is putting you in fights with invisible timers, or not invisible timers, that they just don't tell you about if it's there or not. Meaning that if you fight particular bosses, then Resi 6 can trick you into wasting tons of ammunition against it that you didn't have to because the goal of that moment was not to literally kill the giant monster that is trying to punch you into a pancake, but it was to survive the giant monster attack until a cutscene kills the monster for you. Of course, there's also zero difference between the set pieces that have timers or don't, so it ends up being a Where's Waldo book with Waldo being cloaked. And this isn't an isolated incident. There are so many points throughout the game where the player's input seems totally pointless, because even if you don't shoot anything, you'll still win it if you hit that invisible timer. At one point in Leon's story where you have to fight in the Tower Plaza in China, I swear that you could legitimately beat Sergeant Osaurus by just running around in circles, since you have Ada in an attack helicopter fighting Sergeant and Leon at the same time. So why should the player even give a shit if it's not the player's problem to fight the boss, and the game itself is just going to do all the fighting? God, this is just one of the most stupid, eye-roll inducing game design choices I've ever seen. And even Call of Duty didn't do it this frickin' badly. Jesus Christ. So, after dodging multiple outbreaks and fistfights with Sergeant, he finally gets defeated, being impaled on an obelisk and bleeding to death in the most sigh-worthy moments in any game I ever played outside of the literal last minute of Assassin's Creed Origins. When you see that Sergeant bled out and the blood inexplicably forms the Umbrella Incorporated corporate logo. That is the lowest moment. At least Leon gets to pretend like he did something important today, and Athena gets to settle up with her sister's corpse. The world is at least safe for the next 7 minutes. The next story on the list is Chris and, Hale? Sure, Hale. Leon's campaign was the closest this game got to the original trilogy's formula. But Chris's campaign is way closer to your typical Modern Warfare game for whatever reason. That campaign even starts you off with machine guns, but since ammo is still scarce, trying to be a Modern Warfare game makes even less frickin' sense. The resource balancing in Resi 6 is also totally messed up. It was the #1 thing I hated about it, even with the constant pointless success game design, because it ended up making the healing mechanic completely useless. The problem is that in a hard bit of combat, you end up getting hit with so many cheap shots that you'll be bleeding yourself dry of herbs before you have a chance to even understand what's going on, especially in some of those boss fights Resi 6 has. It wouldn't have been so bad if each herb you used had accounted for more than just a single hit point. Some of these enemies are so tough that they'll take out 1.5 or even a full 2 off you in one shot. It's completely ridiculous. And even if you do lose, the game checkpoints as often as your typical Call of Duty, and fully heals you to the bargain when you die, so when the odds are stacked against you a lot of the time, it's more useful to you to just have the enemy kill you rather than trying to heal yourself back into the fight. Especially since even though the herbs are terrible healing items, the game withholds them from you all of the time, like this is a legit Resi game, which it most obviously is not even close to. Resi 6 is a video game that does so much wrong that it even managed to screw up something so basic as having a med pack mechanic in it. But that's not the last one we'll be looking at, mostly because Chris's campaign starts off on such a bad footing that I'm surprised the whole thing didn't just spontaneously combust 5 minutes in. While Leon was out protecting the president, Chris had kept his job from Resi 5 and continued serving in the BSAA, having been given a higher title and a whole platoon to command. However, before the game even starts, Chris ended up getting ambushed, and the ambush killed every person under his command except for Hale. Chris quickly disappeared off the face of the world and went to live out a terrible existence in the bumfuck of Russia of all places, having shit steaks at a bar until the fateful day that not just Hale went out, and not even other members of his old division, but the BSAA themselves literally ordered this entire new platoon to go out and retrieve Chris Redfield, led by Hale. And this is the guy who couldn't prevent 10 casualties and then just fucked off from the BSAA. This is the guy that these armed forces want back to lead again. And of course, Chris happens to not be jaded enough to turn down their offer, so he ends up getting back in the saddle. Unfortunately, lightning happened to strike Chris twice, and after investigating the C virus outbreak in the fictional Kingdom of Adonia, or something else it was called, he was ambushed by Ada Wong, who infected his new platoon with the C virus, instantly killing all of them. Chris and Hale lived on to see the damage and, like Athena, decide to make a revenge pact against Ada Wong. Hale goes along with this because he apparently has never heard of Moby Dick before. The pair go around and chasing down leads to the same locales as Leon's campaign, which is why they see each other several times on their journeys. They were even there when Ada decided to launch those C-virus nukes against China, and failed to do that, so you already know what happens there. Kind of like Sonic 2006, but that's kind of the only comparison I can make between the two games. Of course, I didn't make the Moby Dick reference just because Chris at one point is going so far to get his personal revenge that it's even going against the most common of sense for him to have, and Hale has to basically bitch slap him back to reality, and even when this happens, Hale still has all the respect in the world for this guy, who's driving himself nuts with depression and seeking validation for his old platoons that he keeps killing, that personally I would be looking for the first bus out of this crap. And it would have been better for him if it had gone that way, because at the end of this campaign and the more terrifying BOWs come out of the woodwork, Hale ends up getting infected by the C-virus pathway somehow, which provided him with silly electrical superpowers that ends up decimating the final BOW almost by itself before it takes over and kills Hale immediately, leaving Chris at the end of Resi 6 basically in the same position that he started in, except that even though he literally lost his entire second platoon, the exact same event that happened at the start of the game that had him go out to bumfuck Russia in a stupid fucking bar, so instead of doing literally that same exact thing, or something else that would make more sense if that was his reaction to getting his entire platoon killed on accident, instead of going back to whatever middle of nowhere tavern he finds, Chris decides to just go back to work on Monday and train up his third platoon of faceless wonks like nothing even happened. It makes the story, and Chris himself, look stupid due to it not being consistent, and considering that losing his second platoon was enough for him to go on an absurdly self-destructive hunt for his platoon's killer, just walking it off over the weekend feels like it missed the mark by a little bit. Just a little tiny bit. And speaking of such, number 3 on our list of whack-ass stories goes to Jake and Sherry. And for whatever reason, the game labels the story as Jake's campaign, when it is obviously Sherry's campaign and Jake's just hanging around and doing basically nothing. Thankfully, the plot's a bit simpler, so we'll be getting through this one pretty damn quick. The campaign starts immediately by Jake Muller encountering Sherry Birkin. Yes, that Sherry Birkin, while she was working in Adonia, and after a bit of negotiating, Jake agrees to come along on Sherry's mission to escort him personally back to America. The reason being that his body has the antidote to the C virus infecting the world at the moment, and I'll drop a spoiler alert because I might as well reveal how that happened. So yeah, spoiler alert! It turned out that Jake Muller is actually Albert Wesker's son, and he inherited the immunity from him. Capcom doesn't explain how Albert had a son, but considering dear old dad, let's just assume that he found a way, possibly asexually, to make it happen just because. The entire campaign is Sherry and Jake ducking the powers that be from Sergeant and Ada fucking around to get Jake to safety. The nice thing about Sherry's campaign is that it has the really nice Titanfall 2 vibe to it, where it feels like a really organic and relatively realistic journey from A to B, and both characters are bringing their own stuff to the table that makes them an oddly appealing double act, which is good because Jake Muller by himself would be insufferable to the nth degree. The problem is that Jake's character sheet was covered in giant block letters dripping in ink that printed the word douche over everything. Jake is the worst kind of douchebag. He's constantly quipping against horrible odds, being unhelpful to his co-op partner and the people who want to help him, just doing things for the money, doing everything just for him, and not considering the world or anybody else around him. The most asshole lone wolf that this franchise has ever spawned and will ever spawn. But next to him is Sherry, and while she's not exactly Jill Valentine, she is actually quite capable on her own. She has the knowledge of the area, the situation, strategies, virology, obviously. She's usually the one that comes up with the plans, and most importantly, she can actually shoot straight. A nice touch to her character was that she inherited Wolverine-esque self-healing abilities from her constant exposure to the G virus, and while that by itself doesn't make her a badass, it is nice to see that she can handle herself in a fight. That gives her some nice wrinkles of tragedy to her character arc, and giving the fans specifically that reference from the older games. Like the other campaigns, the action is intense, the things they have to fight are ridiculous and infinite monstrosities. The game can't shut the fuck up, and will find any excuse to just blow up entire buildings just cause Jake and Sherry happen to be standing there for 5 seconds. While the pair don't specifically have an antagonist, they do have to fight one monster consistently throughout the campaign. The Uganok? The Ergonok? It was something like that. Basically, it's a lame version of Nemesis from back in the day who falls into the same problem as the rest of the game, and that you have no idea when you actually have to fight him or just survive the encounter for long enough. And since he's a Nemesis-style creature, it's inherently difficult to tell if you're actually doing damage to him normally, since he will never show any sign of weakness from being shotgunned in the face. The Ustanok is an irritating creature that reappears constantly and randomly, and while it was okay for Nemesis to be like this because the game taught you very quickly that you never had to specifically fight him until you were forced to, but in Resi 6 the game never gives you the option to just run away in the other direction, because Capcom wanted to enslave its entire audience to the whims of the script. So you just have to eat shit and deal until the final climactic battle in a giant blast furnace, allowing you to finally kill him in Terminator 2 style. What could have been a fun monster to hate instead turns into such a moment of constant sighing whenever you see his stitched together silhouette. Although there was that moment in the middle of the campaign where Jake and Sherry get captured by Neo Umbrella and are experimented on, and that was a cool scene, since it was more of a covert escape and one of the few times that the action tapered off somewhat in this ludicrous sightseeing showcase going at Mach 3. The stealth was garbage, but the section did advance their character arcs very well, which is why I liked it. It actually showed that Jake was still a human being and not an edgelord holding a book full of Spider-Man quotes. The final campaign was the one that used to be secret, but now is unlocked right away on the 8th gen ports. Ada's campaign, and just exactly like her appearance in Resident Evil 4, her story in Resi 6 is essentially her running around and helping the other 3 campaign protagonists out of their shit fits. The ultimate reason why this campaign sucks is that, just like in Resi 4, we never learn what the hell she's doing in Resi 6, and since this is currently her final appearance, I guess we'll end up never knowing what she was doing throughout those 10 years of in-universe character development. Yeah, it is a nice idea to give some characters a little mystery behind their motives, but if it's literally 100% mystery, then I'm not going to give a shit about the character, because you have given me no reason to care about whatever she's doing. The only thing that's confirmed is that she has a personal connection with Sargent because reasons, and she's dead set on killing that clone of Ada that antagonized Chris, because she thinks her running around would ruin her reputation. And that is the worst reason for doing something in a video game that I've ever heard of. If her whole bit in Resident Evil is to be a covert agent, why the fuck would she even think she had a reputation? Her whole deal is just not being found by the enemy. I guess the idea would be that if she left her to continue instigating C-virus outbreaks, that more people and more governments would come after her specifically. But then again, she's always been fighting the long odds, so why would this be any different? All I have about Ada is question after question, and she's never going to answer them, so the entire plot of this campaign is basically a loud fart noise. The gameplay is at least varied and inconsistent, putting her constantly into secondary character shoes, and since she's almost always in important fights with other protagonists, her combat feels especially pointless since the AI could carry on with all of the fighting by themselves, and all you have to do is just run around until the boss falls over, since she has no motivation to do anything and is just falling into problems. I have very little energy to care about whatever she does. She ends up fighting Sargent in part just because she was there at the right time. In addition, Ada's campaign is also clearly the fastest and feels very much inspired by her separate ways, since it is just all of the scenes of her throughout the other 3 campaigns of her appearing and helping, and the stuff that she does off screen is just walk to each of those scenes with nothing meaningful on the way, making you wonder why Capcom bothered to tell this story in which nothing happens and apparently no one is supposed to care about Ada, since Capcom didn't bother telling us why she was doing anything, what her whole deal was. Like, is there a point to her existence at all? I don't know, because I just don't. She does get to fight with her crossbow, which is a mixed bag weapon. It has explosive rounds in it, so there's at least that. She gets to fight the clone of Ada when she transforms into a plaster monster, which was slightly interesting for 20 or so minutes. You know, in all of this critique and all of this examination, the real unfortunate truth about Resi 6 is that for all of its many, many, many faults, the game definitely wasn't dead on arrival, and could have made something out of itself if it was better planned, and I'm wondering how Capcom didn't have better management of this game. Was the rush to slap together a rushed Call of Duty paint job on a Resident Evil game the reason that it has incredibly moronic, strict scripts following so that everything you do is on a linear path set out for you and there's no planning whatsoever? Maybe it's what Capcom considered cinematic gaming and it thought it would have made the game better, but if that's the case, it just ends up backfiring in the most spectacular way possible. by blowing up half of China. That's the thing that gets me about Resi 6. It was that this wasn't a passionless project just for the cash. There's clearly a huge budget behind the game for it to be the longest Resident Evil game ever made, with the 4 campaigns and the different locales, all the special effects and all this large-scale combat, just everything that went into it so clearly. Capcom's team spent thousands of man-hours on putting this thing together, and it's just a badly made game. So botched that it shouldn't have been this hard to see that it didn't work at all right at the frickin' start. The combat being lopsided in difficulty, the constant checkpointing, the stupid-ass survival challenges in the space of where boss fights should have been, on top of the stupid writing, the character decisions, the ideas in general, I guess. It's a gameplay and story hack job that shouldn't have happened. The people behind this game definitely have better talent than this. However, if this game was made more in line with, at the very least, the inspiration of Resi 4, or hell, even Resident Evil 5, this could have easily been saved because the monster designs are still great, the ideas they had for boss fights, the arenas, the gimmicks, the attacks, would have been super fun to experience if the gameplay wasn't such a frickin' train wreck. Personally, I would have been on board all the way for an insanely cinematic, overblown, action-based Resident Evil game where you have to fight these city-spanning threats, fight for your life, run through all these alleys, do super acrobatics. Hell, even the QTEs I'd be up for if they were not totally bullshit. That would have been really fun to see if it was built more like Resident Evil 4 and had all the detailed work going on that game had. But for what we've got, Capcom just did not understand that you cannot take away this much power and decisions from the player in terms of what they're allowed to do through their movement and their shooting, that it just was never going to work. It's a messily designed embarrassment that took all of that time and all of that money, all of those effects people, and just used it to drain all the goodwill that this series had for a few years until it was redeemed with the totally different Resident Evil 7. At least that's what people say about it. Resident Evil 6 had a lot of potential for a game that turned out so bad and so terrible, but that was how short-sighted Capcom was. It could have been fun, hell, it could have been great, but it turned out to be the opposite of that. It's a real shame, really, because we just ended up getting stuck with this. There's no way to fix it, and there's no way to remake it into something better. But for now, let's finish up with a final scoreboard. And give you guys 4 versions of Victory for Gamers. Talk about a bang for your buck. I'll see you next time.